The flames took everything he owned in 3 hours. But in the ashes of his old life, Vincent Chen would discover something worth more than any possession he'd ever lost. Vincent Chen was a man who measured his worth by what surrounded him. At 38, his downtown apartment was a carefully curated museum of success. Vintage guitars lined one wall, each one representing a different achievement in his career as a music producer. Limited edition vinyl records filled custom shelving that stretched from floor to ceiling. His kitchen housed gadgets he'd never used. His closet contained suits for occasions that never came. And his garage stored 3 motorcycles he rarely rode. Every surface told a story of acquisition. The Italian leather couch where he spent most evenings scrolling through auction sites. The mahogany desk that held contracts from artists whose names had faded from memory. The bedroom that showcased watches, cufflinks, and cologne bottles arranged like trophies. Vincent believed that owning beautiful things made him beautiful. That surrounding himself with value made him valuable. His work reflected this philosophy. As a producer, he chased the biggest names, the most expensive studios, the fanciest equipment. He'd built his reputation on creating polished commercial sounds that sold millions but satisfied no one completely. Artists came to him not for inspiration, but for the guarantee of mainstream success. He delivered, they paid, and he bought more things to fill the growing emptiness that prosperity couldn't touch. Vincent's relationships followed the same pattern. He dated women who looked perfect in photographs, attended industry parties where connections mattered more than conversations, and surrounded himself with people who admired his lifestyle but never challenged his choices. His apartment became his sanctuary and his prison, a place where he could admire his collections but never truly connect with another human being. The irony wasn't lost on him during quiet moments. Despite owning instruments worth more than most people's cars, he hadn't written a song for himself in over 5 years. His guitars hung silent, decorative rather than functional. His piano served as a display surface for awards he'd stopped feeling proud of. The music that had once flowed from his heart had been replaced by calculated formulas designed to generate revenue rather than emotion. His family back in Oregon had stopped calling regularly, not from anger, but from the growing distance created by Vincent's obsession with material success. His mother would ask about his happiness during their brief conversations, and he would deflect by describing his latest purchase or professional achievement. His younger sister had tried visiting once, but the sterile perfection of his space made her uncomfortable. She'd left early, saying his apartment felt more like a showroom than a home. The night before the fire, Vincent had spent 3 hours reorganizing his vinyl collection by release date, market value, and personal significance. He'd held each record, remembering not the music it contained, but how much he'd paid for it, and how rare it was. The ritual had become a form of meditation, a way to count his worth when everything else felt uncertain. He'd gone to sleep surrounded by things that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. That final evening, as he'd surveyed his domain from the leather couch, Vincent had felt a familiar hollowness settle in his chest. The apartment was perfect, the collection complete, the career successful by every external measure. Yet something essential was missing, something no amount of acquisition could provide. He'd pushed the feeling down, as he always did, and focused instead on planning his next purchase. A 1959 Les Paul had appeared on an auction site, and he was determined to own it by the end of the week. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Vincent had been dreaming about music, real music, the kind he used to write before success taught him to compromise. In the dream, he was 16 again, sitting at his childhood piano, playing melodies that came from somewhere deeper than technique or training. The phone's harsh ring pulled him back to reality, back to his collection, back to his carefully constructed life. The voice on the other end belonged to his neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, and she was crying. "Fire! 3rd floor, spreading fast. Get out now!" Vincent hung up and smelled it immediately, the acrid smoke that had already begun seeping under his door. He grabbed his phone, his wallet, and ran towards the stairwell, leaving behind everything that had defined him for the past 15 years. Standing on the sidewalk in his pajamas, watching orange flames consume his building, Vincent felt something unexpected wash over him. Not panic, not grief, but a strange sense of freedom. The guitars that had hung silent on his walls were now fuel for fire. The vinyl records that had organized his evenings were melting into toxic puddles. The awards that had validated his career were turning to ash and memory. The fire department worked through the night, but Vincent knew it was over before they did. His unit on the 3rd floor was directly above the electrical fault that had started the blaze. By dawn, when the flames were finally controlled, nothing remained of his apartment except blackened walls and the skeletal remains of furniture he could barely recognize. Mrs. Rodriguez brought him coffee and a blanket as the sun rose over the destruction. She was 82, had lived in the building for 30 years, and had lost everything too. But instead of despair, she radiated a calm acceptance that puzzled Vincent. When he asked how she could be so peaceful after losing a lifetime of possessions, she smiled and said something that would echo in his mind for months afterward. Things are just things, mijo. They keep us busy, but they don't keep us alive. My family is safe, you're safe, and tomorrow we start fresh. Sometimes God burns down our old life so we can build a better one. Vincent spent the next 3 days in a hotel room, dealing with insurance adjusters and trying to catalog what he'd lost. The process was both overwhelming and revelatory. He'd owned so much that he couldn't remember half of it. Guitars he'd forgotten he'd bought. Equipment he'd never learned to use properly. Books he'd displayed, but never read. The list of possessions grew longer, but with each item he added, Vincent felt lighter, rather than heavier. On the 4th day, something remarkable happened. He woke up without the usual anxiety that had plagued his mornings for years. There was no collection to maintain, no careful arrangement to preserve, no status to protect through accumulation. For the first time in decades, Vincent faced a day with no possessions to define him and no image to uphold. He walked to a nearby music store, not to buy anything but simply to touch instruments again. The owner, an elderly man named Frank, let him play a beat-up acoustic guitar that had been sitting in the corner for months. Vincent's fingers found chords he'd forgotten he knew, and melodies began flowing that had nothing to do with market research or commercial appeal. Frank listened without judgment as Vincent played song fragments that emerged from some long-buried creative source. When Vincent finally stopped, Frank said quietly, "Sounds like you've got something to say." Sounds like it's been waiting a long time to come out. That night, Vincent called his sister for the first time in 8 months. Instead of describing his latest acquisition, he told her about the fire. Instead of deflecting her questions about his happiness, he admitted he wasn't sure what happiness meant anymore. For the first time in years, they talked for over an hour, and when he hung up, Vincent realized he felt more connected to another human being than he had in any of his carefully curated relationships. The insurance settlement arrived 6 weeks after the fire. A check that represented 15 years of careful acquisition reduced to a number on paper. Vincent held it for a long time, thinking about all the things he could replace, all the collections he could rebuild. The amount was substantial enough to recreate his old life almost exactly. He could find another apartment, buy back the guitars, rebuild the vinyl collection, surround himself again with beautiful objects that meant nothing and everything. Instead, he deposited the check and rented a furnished studio apartment across town. 1 room, 1 window, 1 guitar that the landlord had left behind. The space was smaller than his old walk-in closet, but it felt infinite. Without possessions to organize and maintain, Vincent discovered he had hours of free time he'd forgotten existed. He used those hours to remember who he'd been before success taught him to measure worth in objects. The guitar became his companion and teacher. It was a cheap acoustic with nylon strings, probably worth less than any individual item from his destroyed collection. But when Vincent played it, the music that emerged wasn't calculated or commercial. It was raw, honest, and achingly beautiful. Songs poured out of him like water through a broken dam, melodies he'd been carrying for years without realizing it. Frank, the music store owner, became an unlikely mentor. Vincent would visit his shop not to buy anything, but to learn. Frank had spent 50 years in the music business, had seen trends come and go, had watched countless musicians lose themselves in the pursuit of commercial success. He taught Vincent about the difference between making music and making money, about the courage required to create something authentic in a world that rewarded conformity. Under Frank's guidance, Vincent began performing at open mic nights around the city. Not as Vincent Chen, the successful producer, but simply as a man with a guitar and something to say. His first performance was terrifying. He'd forgotten what it felt like to stand in front of people without the armor of his reputation, without expensive equipment to hide behind. His voice shook, his hands trembled, but the song that came out was more honest than anything he'd produced in his professional studio. The audience that night was small, maybe 15 people in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and broken dreams. But when Vincent finished his song, something magical happened. A woman in the back corner, someone he'd never seen before, began crying. Not polite appreciation or artistic admiration, but genuine emotional response to something she'd heard in his music that touched whatever pain she carried. After the performance, she approached him and said simply, "Thank you. I needed to hear that tonight." Vincent realized he'd spent years creating music that moved units, but had forgotten how to create music that moved people. The song he'd played wasn't perfect, wasn't polished, wasn't commercial, but it was true. And truth had a power that no amount of studio manipulation could replicate. Vincent started visiting the local homeless shelter, not as a volunteer initially, but as someone trying to understand what it meant to lose everything. He met people who'd lost jobs, homes, families, health, hope. But he also met people who'd found something in their loss that they'd never possessed in their prosperity. Grace, resilience, an understanding of what actually mattered when everything else was stripped away. One evening, while serving dinner at the shelter, Vincent met an elderly man named Eugene, who'd been a professional musician in the 1970s. Eugene had lost his apartment to medical bills, had been living in his car for 3 months, but still carried a harmonica in his pocket. When Eugene played that harmonica, the entire shelter fell silent. His music contained decades of joy and sorrow, triumph and defeat, all distilled into notes that spoke directly to the soul. Eugene taught Vincent about the difference between performing music and sharing music. When you perform, Eugene explained, you're trying to impress people. When you share, you're trying to heal them. The first makes you famous. The second makes you useful. Vincent began writing songs about the people he met at the shelter. Not charity anthems or pity ballads, but honest portraits of human beings who'd found dignity in circumstances that would break most people's spirits. He learned their stories not as research for his music, but as a way to understand his own journey from having everything to needing nothing. The transformation wasn't immediate or easy. Vincent still caught himself browsing online stores, still felt the old urge to acquire and accumulate. But the urges grew weaker as his new life grew stronger. He was discovering that owning less meant being more. That needing fewer things meant connecting more deeply with people. That the space he'd created by losing his possessions had been filled with something far more valuable than anything he'd ever owned. 8 months after the fire, Vincent discovered his true calling in the most unexpected place. He'd been visiting the children's wing of the county hospital, playing guitar for young patients who were facing battles that made his own struggles seem trivial. These kids taught him about courage in its purest form, about finding joy in small moments, about the healing power of music when it comes from genuine care, rather than commercial calculation. The idea struck him during a conversation with a 7-year-old girl named Luna, who was undergoing treatment for leukemia. She'd requested a song about flying, not because she wanted to escape her circumstances, but because she wanted to imagine freedom for other kids who felt trapped by their situations. Vincent wrote the song that night, recorded it simply on his phone, and played it for her the next day. Luna's response changed everything he thought he knew about success. She didn't just smile or clap politely. She closed her eyes and swayed gently, and when the song ended, she said, "That made my chest feel warm, like the medicine, but better." Vincent realized that his music had just accomplished something more important than any platinum album or industry award. It had provided genuine comfort to another human being in their moment of need. Vincent approached Frank with an idea that had been forming in his mind for weeks. What if they created a non-profit organization that brought music directly to people who couldn't access traditional entertainment? Not just hospitals, but nursing homes, homeless shelters, rehabilitation centers, anywhere that people were struggling with isolation or despair. Frank's eyes lit up immediately. He'd been waiting 30 years for someone to suggest exactly this kind of project. They started small, incredibly small. Vincent used a portion of his insurance money to buy basic recording equipment, nothing fancy, just enough to capture honest performances. Frank provided workspace in the back of his music store. They reached out to local musicians who'd lost their way in the commercial music industry, people who remembered why they'd fallen in love with music before the business side complicated everything. The first official program they launched was called Songs for Healing. Vincent would visit healthcare facilities with volunteer musicians, and they'd perform personalized songs for patients who requested them. Not cover songs or popular hits, but original compositions based on the patient's story, their hopes, their struggles, their dreams. The songwriting process became as therapeutic as the final performance. Vincent developed a systematic approach that made the program sustainable and scalable. First, he'd spend time listening to each patient's story without any agenda beyond understanding their perspective. Then, he'd collaborate with volunteer musicians to create musical arrangements that matched the emotional tone of the person's experience. The songs were recorded simply but professionally, and patients received copies they could keep forever. The breakthrough came when Vincent realized they could train other people to replicate this process. He created a curriculum that taught healthcare workers, family members, and volunteers how to facilitate musical storytelling sessions. The program wasn't about musical expertise, but about human connection. Anyone could learn to help another person transform their experiences into song, regardless of technical skill or professional training. Within 6 months, Songs for Healing was operating in 12 facilities across the city. Vincent had discovered something remarkable about scalable impact. It wasn't about creating one perfect program, but about creating a simple system that ordinary people could implement with extraordinary results. The musicians who volunteered weren't seeking fame or payment. They were seeking the same thing Vincent had found: the profound satisfaction of using their talents to serve something larger than themselves. The financial model emerged organically. Healthcare facilities began requesting regular programming and offering modest compensation for services. Local foundations started providing grants specifically for therapeutic music initiatives. Vincent was careful to keep overhead minimal and impact maximal. Nobody got rich from Songs for Healing, but everyone involved felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with money. Vincent's personal transformation accelerated as the program grew. He was working longer hours than he ever had as a commercial producer, but the exhaustion felt completely different. Instead of the hollow fatigue that came from pursuing profits, he experienced the energizing tiredness that resulted from pursuing purpose. His music was serving people who genuinely needed what he could provide. The most profound change was in Vincent's relationship with success itself. For the first time in his adult life, he measured achievement not by what he accumulated, but by what he contributed. The program's success wasn't reflected in his bank account or his possessions, but in the letters from patients, the stories from healthcare workers, and the gradual healing that music facilitated in spaces that desperately needed hope. By the end of his first year running Songs for Healing, Vincent had facilitated over 300 personalized songs for people facing some of life's most difficult challenges. He trained 47 volunteers in the therapeutic songwriting process. He'd established partnerships with organizations that shared his vision of music as medicine rather than mere entertainment. Most importantly, he discovered that losing everything had been the prerequisite for finding everything that actually mattered. 3 years after the fire that burned away his old life, Vincent Chen sits in the same coffee shop where he performed his first honest song. But today he's not here to perform. He's here to meet with Maria Santos, a documentary filmmaker who wants to tell the story of Songs for Healing and its impact on communities across the region. The program now operates in 43 facilities across 3 states, has trained over 200 volunteers, and has created more than 1,500 personalized songs for people facing medical, emotional, and social challenges. Vincent looks different now. His clothes are simple but well-maintained, chosen for comfort and functionality rather than image. His hands are calloused from playing guitar daily, not for practice, but for service. The watch he wears was a gift from Luna, the young girl whose request for a song about flying had catalyzed his transformation. It's a plastic digital watch that cost $12, but he treasures it more than any of the expensive timepieces he'd lost in the fire. The conversation with Maria flows naturally because Vincent has learned to talk about his work without ego or self-promotion. He describes the program's methodology, with the same careful attention he once applied to describing his vintage guitar collection. But now the details serve purpose rather than pride. When Maria asks about his personal journey, Vincent finds himself grateful for a question he once would have deflected or minimized. He tells her about waking up each morning with clarity about his daily purpose. He explains how the fire had revealed the difference between being successful and being useful, between impressing people and serving them. Vincent shares stories about volunteers who'd discovered their own calling through the program, about healthcare workers who'd learned to use music as medicine, about patients whose healing had accelerated through the power of personalized song. The financial aspect of his new life fascinates Maria almost as much as the emotional transformation. Vincent lives comfortably, but simply in a modest 2-bedroom apartment. One bedroom serves as his living space, the other as a home office for Songs for Healing administration. His monthly expenses are less than he used to spend on a single vintage guitar, but his sense of abundance has never been greater. Vincent's relationship with material possessions has evolved into something balanced and intentional. He owns 3 guitars now, the cheap acoustic his landlord had left behind, a mid-range electric for recording purposes, and a classical guitar specifically chosen for hospital performances, because its nylon strings create a particularly soothing tone. Each instrument serves a function, rather than feeding an acquisition compulsion. He buys what he needs, and finds profound satisfaction in needing very little. His family relationships have been transformed as dramatically as his professional life. His sister visits regularly now, bringing her children to see their uncle, who's finally discovered what makes him happy. His mother, who'd worried for years about his isolated lifestyle, often tells friends about Vincent's work with a pride that had been missing when his achievements were measured solely in commercial success. The conversations that once focused on his latest purchases now center on the stories of people he served and the impact he's witnessed. Vincent has begun speaking at conferences and workshops, not about music production or business success, but about the relationship between loss and discovery, between letting go and finding purpose. His presentations are requested by healthcare organizations, nonprofit leadership conferences, and groups focused on career transition and life redesign. He shares his story not as a blueprint others should copy, but as evidence that devastating change can lead to unexpected fulfillment. The speaking engagements have created another revenue stream that supports the organization's expansion. Vincent is careful to reinvest these earnings into program development rather than lifestyle enhancement. The money allows Songs for Healing to provide better training for volunteers, higher quality equipment for recordings, and expanded programming for underserved communities. Financial success, when directed toward meaningful purpose, creates a completely different relationship with abundance. Vincent's romantic life has also shifted dramatically. He's in a relationship now with Sarah, a grief counselor who'd first encountered his work when he provided musical support for one of her groups. Their connection is based on shared values and complementary service, rather than mutual admiration for lifestyle or status. They support each other's work and create a life together that prioritizes meaning over material accumulation. As the documentary interview concludes, Maria asks Vincent what advice he would give to someone who feels trapped by their possessions or their pursuit of traditional success. Vincent considers the question carefully, remembering the man he'd been before the fire taught him who he could become. "Don't wait for everything to burn down," he says quietly. "Start choosing what matters before circumstances force the choice on you. Find one way to use your talents in service of other people's healing, and let that small beginning show you what's possible. The life you're afraid to lose might be preventing you from finding the life you're meant to live." Vincent walks home through neighborhoods where he now knows people's names and stories, where his presence contributes to community rather than simply consuming from it. His apartment contains everything he needs and nothing that distracts from his purpose. As evening settles over the city, he picks up his acoustic guitar and plays not for performance or practice, but for the pure joy of creating something beautiful in a world that desperately needs more beauty. The fire that destroyed his collection had revealed his true treasure, the capacity to heal others through music, to build something that would outlast any possession, to live with purpose rather than just pursuing profit. Vincent Chen had lost everything he thought he wanted and discovered everything he'd actually needed. In the ashes of his curated life, he'd found his authentic self and the work that would define the rest of his days. End of the story. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories of overcoming, and leave your comment below. Your message might brighten someone's day. See you in the next video.